What's up, folks? Nate here at Two Wheel Dyno Works. Today we are back on our dyno with our 2025 Honda CB750 Hornet, and today we're doing some full exhaust system and air filter testing. We've got the full Dominator exhaust system now installed on the bike, and we've also even got a DNA air filter there in the airbox. I've tested sort of every phase now of the basic bolt-on modifications for these bikes, so let's quickly just break down where we started with the last time we went ahead and showed you guys a video of the slip-on only performance on these bikes, so we can see what we've gained from a header and from a DNA air filter. So here's how this breaks down. The red line there on the graph that you can see here is the bike in bone stock configuration on our dyno. The blue line is still the stock bike, but with our custom ECU mapping in place. That is still with the stock airbox, stock intake, stock exhaust system. You can see that obviously there's huge performance improvements to be had just from tuning alone. But then the green line is when we installed this Dominator slip-on, and the performance improvements are even larger everywhere. You've got big gains off the bottom, you've got decent gains through the mid-range, and then enormous ones out there at the very top end of the rev range. Stock, the bike made just under 80 horsepower and 52 and a third pound-foot of torque to the tire. And with the slip-on and proper tuning in place, we're about 93.5 horsepower and 55 pound-feet of torque to the tire. So once we had the Dominator slip-on mapping installed, the next step was to obviously install the Dominator header. And that actually had an effect that I wasn't quite expecting to see. There's huge mid-range gains here throughout the meat of the rev range, where you're normally riding this bike, around like 5,500 to 7,500 RPM. You gain a significant amount of power and torque there. But you actually lose just a hair out here at the top end. It doesn't rev out quite as cleanly as it did with a stock header in place way out there above like 10,000 RPM. Now, you're almost never there on these bikes, so this very slight loss is definitely worth having this enormous mid-range improvement where you're normally riding these bikes. But I was still surprised to see the aftermarket header actually flow this much better through the mid-range, but just not quite as well out there at the very top end. And for those of you who want to see the exact figure, sort of right in the middle of that section of the RPM range that is improved, I've highlighted about 6,200 RPM there for you, and you've picked up about 3 pound-feet of torque and about 4 horsepower to the tire in that window. Now again, I really was surprised to actually see that it didn't carry the revs just a little bit further with the aftermarket header installed from Dominator, and instead we had those big mid-range gains, but we actually lost a little bit right out there at the very top end. Now, you'll probably never feel that. I certainly couldn't tell any difference whatsoever way out there when I was riding it, but you definitely feel the mid-range improvement, and it is quite dramatic when you're actually riding the bike. It just feels like it pulls way harder when you're rolling on the throttle, because that's kind of where you're normally riding the bike. So if you're coming out of a corner at 5, 6, 7,000 RPM and you're whacking it, you definitely feel the improvement with the header on there versus having just the slip-on installed. Now, the next thing we swapped out on this bike was the air filter, because on the Transalp, which utilizes this exact same Honda 750 Unicam engine, the air filter was worth a couple few horsepower. But while we had the tank off the bike, we did notice that the airbox on the CB750 is quite a bit smaller than the airbox on the Transalp. So I wasn't really certain what to expect when we swapped out the filter, and here's what we actually saw to the tire on the dyno in terms of performance improvement. The blue line there is with the DNA air filter installed, and the red line is with the stock filter installed. And it's really hard to even see the difference, because at no point throughout the entirety of the rev range is there a 1 horsepower or greater change in performance. Even out there at 10,000 RPM, you are seeing a whopping 0.7 horsepower improvement by swapping out the OEM air filter. Now again, that did surprise me, because on the Transalp, with the same engine, we saw 2 to 3 horsepower. But the second we saw just how much smaller the 750 airbox is on the Hornet versus on the Transalp, I had a feeling we might see a different result by swapping out the filter. The airbox volume here seems to probably be a little bit of the physical restriction on the intake side of the equation now, but luckily some aftermarket intakes will likely be developed here in the near future for this bike, and that will definitely address that problem. So now that we've got an aftermarket air filter installed, a proper full exhaust system, and our custom ECU mapping in place to match the new airflow characteristics of those modifications, let's take a look at how this bike started bone stock versus how it's sitting now, because the transformation is truly mind-blowing. The red line's bone stock, and the blue line's how it's sitting on the dyno right now. You were talking about a massive 12 pound-foot of torque improvement right there off the bottom at like 3,500 RPM, and you're talking about nearly 20 horsepower out here at the very top of the rev range. There are just enormous gains everywhere to be had with a full exhaust system, and our custom tuning in place, and a little bit of improvement from the air filter. And it doesn't honestly even look like the same power curve of the same motorcycle anymore. Now, it's really important here to note that while we were able to retain the O2 sensors on this bike with just a slip-on installed, you can't do that once you get a full system on here. With the full system installed on the bike and proper tuning in place, there are portions of the rev range you're having to increase fuel volume by more than 25%. The stock O2 sensors will simply try to lean that out too dramatically to be able to really run these safely with a full system and retain that closed loop function. So it is not optional that the O2 sensors must be unplugged when you're installing a full system on one of these bikes and you're getting it properly tuned. Otherwise, you're just going to have problems. Now, with our custom ECU mapping in place, we eliminate the fault codes for those O2 sensors. So you can remove them from the bike entirely if you want to, but you really just need to have them both unplugged. You won't have any issues or check engine lights or anything like that. Again, these are very old school narrowband O2 sensors. They are not really used so much for fine tuning these motorcycles. They are really just there for emissions compliance, and you just can't have them on there with a proper full exhaust in place. Now, there's also an air injection system on these bikes, like most other modern motorcycles, sitting up there on top of the valve cover. I'm not going to bother showing a video of it because the process of plugging off an air injection system hasn't changed in like the last 2 decades. So you will need to go ahead and plug off the air injection feed hose from the air box on these bikes. Otherwise, with the full system installed, the appropriate amount of fuel to match the airflow characteristics of the full system, and the air injection system still functional, it will pop and crackle quite a bit on deceleration. That's not great for the long-term health of the engine, so we strongly recommend that you plug off that air injection system when you're doing a full exhaust on these bikes. But you do need to make sure that you leave the air injection solenoid plugged in, because at this time, there's no way to disable that fault code in the flashing software. So while you can plug off the hose with a marble, a vacuum cap, whatever it is, to prevent airflow from going from the airbox to the solenoid up under there on top of the cylinder head cover, you gotta leave the solenoid itself plugged in. So now that we've covered that, if you guys have any other questions whatsoever about getting your new Honda CB750 Hornet properly tuned and dialed in for your specific intake and exhaust setup, please do not hesitate to email us at support@tooldynoworks.com. I personally answer any all tech support questions every single day that we're open here at the shop, and I can guarantee that you are simply not going to find higher quality intake and exhaust specific tuning for these bikes anywhere else than right here at Tool Dynoworks, because nobody else is going through anywhere near this level of intake and exhaust specific tuning R&D that we have already and will continue to do as new intake and exhaust components come out for these bikes.